Chapter 15, Biodiversity and Conservation. 15.1 Biodiversity. 15.1 Biodiversity. If an alien from a distant galaxy were to visit our planet Earth, the first thing that would amaze and baffle him would most probably be the enormous diversity of life that he would encounter. Even for humans, the rich variety of living organisms with which they share this planet never ceases to astonish and fascinate us. The common man would find it hard to believe that there are more than 20,000 species of ants, 3 lakh species of beetles, 28,000 species of fishes, and nearly 20,000 species of orchids. Ecologists and evolutionary biologists have been trying to understand the significance of such diversity by asking important questions. Why are there so many species? 15.1 Biodiversity. In our biosphere, immense diversity or heterogeneity exists not only at the species level but at all levels of biological organization, ranging from micromolecules within cells to biomes. Biodiversity, the term popularized by the sociobiologist Edward Wilson, to describe the combined diversity at all the levels of biological organization. The most important of them are genetic diversity. A single species might show high diversity at the genetic level or its distributional range. Genetic variation shown by the medicinal plant Rauwolfia vomitoria. A single species might show high diversity at the genetic level over its distributional range. The genetic variation shown by the medicinal plant growing in different ranges might be in terms of the potency and concentration of the active chemical reserpine that the plant produces. India has more than 50,000 genetically different strains of rice. 50,000 genetically different strains of rice and 1,000 varieties of mango. Species diversity. The diversity at the species level, for example, the Western Ghats have a greater amphibian species diversity. Western Ghats have a greater amphibian species diversity than the Eastern Ghats. Ecological diversity at the ecosystem level, India, for instance, with its deserts, rainforests, mangroves, coral reefs, wetlands, estuaries, and alpine meadows, has a greater ecosystem diversity than a Scandinavian country like Norway. It has taken millions of years of village to accumulate this rich diversity in nature, but we could lose all that wealth in less than 2 centuries if the present rates of species losses continue. Biodiversity and its conservation are now vital environmental issues of international concern as more and more people around the world begin to realize the critical importance of biodiversity for our survival and well-being on this planet. 15.1. How many species are there on Earth and how many in India? Since there are published records of all the species discovered and we know how many species in all have been recorded so far, but it is not easy to answer the question of how many species there are on Earth. According to the IUCN, the total number of plant and animal species described so far is slightly more than 1.5 million, but we have no clear idea of how many species are yet to be discovered. And IUCN, International Union of Conservation of Natural Resources, but we have no clear idea of how many species are yet to be discovered and described. Estimates vary widely, and many of them are only educated guesses. For many taxonomic groups, species inventories are more complete in temperate than in tropical countries. Considering that an overwhelmingly large proportion of the species waiting to be discovered are in the tropics, biologists make a statistical comparison to the temperate tropical species richness of an exhaustively studied group of insects and extrapolate this ratio to the other groups of animals and plants to come up with a gross estimate of the total number of species on Earth. Some extreme estimates range from 20 to 50 million, but a more conservative and scientifically sound estimate made by Robert May places the global species diversity of about 7 million. Let us look at some interesting species about Earth's biodiversity based on the currently available species inventories. More than 70% of all the species recorded are animals. 70% of are animals. While plants including alga, fungi, bryophytes, gymnosperms and angiosperms comprise no more than 22% of the total. Among animals, insects are the most species-rich taxonomy, making up more than 70%. That means out of every 10 animals on this planet, 7 are insects. Again, how do we explain this enormous diversification of insects? The number of fungi species in the world is more than the combined fungi species in the world is more than the combined total of the species of fishes, amphibians, reptiles and mammals. Fungi is equal to PARM. PARM. Biodiversity is repeated, showing species number of major taxa. Invertebrates, other animal groups, crustaceans, mollusk, insects, mollusk, crustacean, other animal groups. Vertebrates, PARAM. Plants, fungi, angiosperms, algae, lichens, mosses, ferns and allies. Fungi, angiosperms, alga, mosses, ferns and allies, lichens. Represent number of species of major taxa of plants and vertebrates and vertebrates. It should be noted that these estimates do not give any figures for prokaryotes. Biologists are not sure about how many prokaryotic species there might be. The problem is that conventional taxonomic methods are not suitable for identifying microbial species, and how many species are simply not culturable under laboratory conditions. If we accept biochemical or molecular criteria for delineating species for this group, then their diversity alone might run into millions. Okay. Although India has only 2.4% of the world's land area, its share of the global species diversity is an impressive 8.1%. That is what makes our country one of the 12 mega diversity countries of the world. 12 mega diversities of the world. Nearly 45,000 of species of plants and twice as of animals have been recorded from India. How many living species are actually there waiting to be discovered and named? If we accept May's global estimate, only 22% of the total species have been recorded. So applying this proportion to India's diversity, we estimate that there are probably more than 1 lakh plants, more than 3 animals will yet to be discovered and described. Would we ever able to consider the immense trained manpower and the time required to complete the job? The situation appears more hopeless when we realize that a large fraction of these species faces the threat of becoming even before we discover them. Nature's biological library is burning even before we catalog the titles of all the books stocked there. Patterns of biodiversity, latitudinal gradients. The diversity of plants and animals is not uniform throughout the world but shows a rather uneven distribution. For many groups of animals or plants, there are interesting patterns in diversity, the most well known being the latitudinal gradient in diversity. In general, species diversity decreases as we move away from the equator towards the poles. Equator towards the poles, species diversity decreases. With very few exceptions, tropics harbor more species than temperate or polar areas. Colombia, located near the equator, has nearly this of birds, while New York at 41 degrees north has 100 species, and Greenland only fit in India, with much of its land area in the tropical area, has more than 12 species of bird. A forest in a tropical region like equator has up to 10 times as many species of vascular. Largely tropical Amazonian rainforest in South America has the greatest biodiversity. It's home to more than 40,000 species of plants, 3,000 of fishes, 13,000 of birds, 27 of animals, 47 and more than 1,25,000 invertebrates. Scientists estimate that in this rainforest there might be at least 2 million insect species waiting to be discovered and named. What is so special about tropics that might account for the greater biological diversity? Ecologists and evolutionary biologists have proposed various hypotheses. Some important ones are: speciation is generally a function of time. Unlike temperate regions subjected to frequent glaciations in the past, tropical latitudes have remained relatively undisturbed for millions of years and thus had a long evolutionary time for species diversification. Tropical environments, unlike temperate ones, are least seasonal, relatively more constant and predictable. Constant temperatures, constant environment promote Nike specialization and lead to a greater spend, and there is more solar energy available in the tropics, which contributes more solar highest probability. This in turn might contribute in to greater diversity. Second, species area relationship. During his pioneering and extensive explorations in the wilderness of South American jungles, the great German naturalist and geographer Alexander von Humboldt observed that within a region's species richness increased with increasing explored area, but only up to a limit. In fact, the relation between species richness and area for a wide variety of taxa, angiosperm plants, birds, bats, freshwater fishes, turns out to be a rectangular hyperbola. Figure 15.2. On a logarithmic scale, the relationship is a straight line described by the equation log s is equal to log c plus z log a, where s is equal to species richness, a is equal to area, z is equal to slope of the line, regression coefficient. What is regression coefficient here? Z. Log S is equal to log C plus Z log A. Increase with increasing species richness, increased with increasing is but only up to a limit. Slope of the line regression coefficient, C is y-intercept. Species richness area log scale, S is equal to C A Z log S is equal to log C plus Z log A. Ecologists have discovered that the value of Z lies in the range of 0.1 to 0.2. तो लाइट बंद करून दे नहीं करून. Regardless of the taxonomic group or the region, whether it is in the plant in Britain, birds in California, or mollusks in New York State, the slopes of the regression line are amazingly similar. But if you analyze the species area relation among very large areas like the entire continents, you will find that the slope of the line to be much steeper. Z values in the range of 0.6 to 1.2. For example, the frugivorous birds are mammals in the tropics of different countries. The slope is found to be 1.15. Frugivorous eating birds. What do steeper slopes mean in this context? Log scale is equal to SC Z log S is equal to log C plus Z log E. The importance of species diversity to the ecosystem. Does the number of species in a community really matter to the functioning of the ecosystem? This is a question for why ecologists have not been able to give a definitive. For many decades, ecologists believe that communities with more species generally tend to be more stable than those with less species. What exactly is stability for a biological community? A stable community should not show too much variation in productivity from year to year. It must be either resistant or resilient to occasional disturbances. A stable community should not show too much variation in product from year to year. It must be either resistant or resilient to it, and it must also be resistant to invasions by alien species. We don't know these attributes are linked to species resistance, but David Tillman's long-term ecosystem experiment using outdoor plots provides some tentative answer. Tillman found the plots with more species showed less year-to-year variation in total biomass. He also showed that in his experiments, increased diversity contributed to higher productivity. Although we may not understand completely how rich species richness contributes to the well-being of an ecosystem, we know enough to realize that rich biodiversity is not only essential for ecosystem health but imperative for the very survival of the human race on this planet. At a time when we are losing species at an alarming pace, one might ask, does it really matter to us if a species became extinct? Would Western Ghats ecosystem be less functional if one of its tree frog species is lost forever? How is our quality of life affected if, say, instead of 2000 we have only 15,000 of ants on Earth? There are no answers to such naive questions, but we can develop a proper perspective through an analogy, the Popper hypothesis, used by Stanford ecologist Paul Heldrick. In an aeroplane, aeroplane is ecosystem, all parts are joined together using thousands of private species. If every passenger traveling in it starts pooping rabbit to take home, cause the species to become extinct. It may not affect flight safety, proper functioning of the ecosystem initially. But as more and more rabbits are removed, the plane becomes dangerous quickly over a period of time. Furthermore, which rabbit is removed may also be critical. Loss of rabbits on the wings, key species that drive major ecosystem function, is obviously a more serious threat to flight safety than loss of aviators on the seats or windows inside the plane. 15.1.4 Loss of biodiversity. While it is doubtful if any new species are being added through speciation into the Earth's treasury of species, there is no doubt about their continuing losses. The biological wealth of our planet has been declining rapidly, and the accusing finger is clearly pointing to human activities. The colonization of tropical Pacific lands by humans is said to have led to the extinction of more than 2,000 species of native birds. The IUCN Red List documents the extinction of 784 species, including the last 500 years. Some examples of recent extinction include the dodo mauritius, quagga africa, thylacine Australia, Steller sea cow Russia, and three subspecies Bali Javan Caspian of tiger. The last 20 years, subspecies of tiger. The last 20 years alone have witnessed the disappearance of 27 species. Careful analysis of record shows that extinction across taxa are not random. Some groups like amphibians appear to be more vulnerable to extinction. Adding to the grim scenario of extinctions is the fact that more than 15,000 worldwide are facing the threat of extinction. Presently, 12% of all bird species are 23% of all mammal species. 23% of all mammal species, 32% of all amphibian species, and 31% of all gymnosperm species in the world face the threat of extinction. That is, first is amphibian, then gymnosperms, then mammals, and then birds. First is gymnosperms. No. First is amphibian species, then gymnosperm species, then comes the mammal, and then comes the bird. 12, 23, 32, 31. From a study of the history of life on Earth through fossil records, we learn that large-scale loss of species like the one we are currently witnessing have also happened earlier, even before humans appeared on the scene. During the long period, greater than 3 billion years, since the origin and diversification of life on Earth, there were 5 episodes of mass extinction. 5 episodes of mass extinction of species. How is the sixth extinction presently in progress different from the previous episode? The difference is in the rates. The current species extinction rates are estimated to be 100 to 1000 times faster than in pre-human times and are actively responsible for the faster rate. Ecologists warn that if the present trends continue, nearly half of all the species on Earth might be wiped out within the next 100 years. In general, loss of biodiversity in the region may lead to decline in plant production, lower resistance to environmental perturbations such as drought, and increased variability in certain ecosystem processes such as plant productivity, water use, and pest and disease cycles. Causes of biodiversity losses. The accelerated rates of species extinction that the world is facing now are largely due to human activities. There are 4 major causes. The evil quadrillate is a sobriquet used to describe them. Habitat loss and fragmentation. This is the most important cause driving animals. Most important. Habitat loss and fragmentation and plants to coexistence. The most dramatic examples of habitat loss come from tropical rainforests. Once cover them more than 14% of Earth's land surface, these rainforests now cover no more than 6%. Important line, alert, trend alert. 14% of the Earth's land surface, these rainforests now cover no more than 6%. They are being destroyed fast. By the time you finish reading this chapter, 1,000 more hectares of rainforest would have been lost. The Amazon rainforest is so used that it is called the lungs of the planet. Harbouring probably millions of species is being cut and cleared for cultivating soybeans or for conversion to land for raising beef cattle. Besides total loss, the degradation of many habitats by pollution also threatens the survival of many species. When large habitats are broken into small fragments due to various human mammals and birds requiring large territories, and certain mammals with the migratory habits are badly affected, leading to population declines. Overexploitation. Humans have always depended on nature for food and shelter, but when it turns to greed, it leads to overexploitation of natural resources. Many species extinction in the last 500 years, Steller sea cow, passenger pigeon, were due to overexploitation by humans. Presently, many marine fish populations around the world are over-harvested, endangering the continued extinctions of some commercially important species. Alien species invasions. When alien species are introduced unintentionally or deliberately for whatever purpose, some of them turn invasive and cause decline or extinction of indigenous species. The Nile perch introduced into Lake Victoria in East Africa led eventually in the extinction of ecologically unique assemblage of more than 200 species of jellyfish in the lake. Humans must be familiar with the environmental damage caused and threat posed to our native species by invasive weed species like carrot grass, lantana, and water hyacinth, Ecornia crassips, Parthenium. The recent illegal production of the African catfish Clarias caripinus for Aquaculture purposes is posing a threat to the indigenous catfishes in our rivers. Coextinction: when a species becomes extinct, the plant and animal species are associated with it in an obligatory way also become extinct. Co-extinction: when a host species becomes extinct, its unique asymmetry of pairs also begins the same fate. Another example is the case of co-evolved pollinator mutualism, where extinction of one invariably leads to the extinction of the other. Biodiversity conservation. Why should we conserve biodiversity? There are many reasons, some obvious and others not so obvious, but all equally important. They can be grouped into three categories: narrowly utilitarian, broadly utilitarian, and ethical. The narrowly utilitarian arguments for conserving biodiversity are obvious. Humans derive countless direct economic benefits from nature: food, firewood, fiber, construction material, industrial products, and products of medicinal importance. More than 25% of the drugs currently sold in the market worldwide are derived from plants, and 25,000 species of plants contribute to the traditional medicines used by native peoples around the world. Nobody knows how many more medicinally useful plants there are in tropical and forests waiting to be explored. With increasing resources put into bioprospecting, exploring molecular genetics, and specifically for products of economic and prospecting, nations endowed with rich biodiversity can expect to reap enormous benefit. The broadly utilitarian argument says that biodiversity plays a major role in many ecosystem services that nature provides. The fast dwindling Amazon is estimated to produce through photosynthesis 20% of the total oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. Can we put an economic value of this service by nature? You can get some idea by finding out how much your neighborhood hospital spends on a cylinder of oxygen. Pollination, without which plants cannot give us fruits or shade, is another system provides through pollinators. Layer bees, bumblebees, birds, and bats. What will be the cost of accomplishing pollination without help from natural products? There are other intangible benefits that we derive from nature: the aesthetic pleasures of walking through thick woods, watching spring flowers in full bloom, or waking up a bulbul song in the morning. Can we put a price tag on such things? The ethical argument for conserving biodiversity relates to what we owe to the millions of plant, animal, and microspecies with whom we share this planet. Philosophically or spiritually, we need to realize that every species has an intrinsic value. Even it may not be of current or any economic value to us, we have a moral duty to care for their well-being and pass on our biological legacy in order to future generations. How do we conserve biodiversity? When we conserve and protect the whole ecosystem, its biodiversity at all levels is protected. We save the entire forest to save the tiger. This approach is called in situ. First one is in situ conservation, on site. If we have to save the tiger, we will save the entire forest. That is in situ conservation. However, when there are situations where an animal or plant is endangered or threatened and needs urgent measures to save it from extinction, ex situ conservation is the desirable approach. If the tiger's forest is destroyed, so tiger is in extinction. Yes, of course. So it needs urgent measures. So ex situ, off-site conservation. In situ conservation. Faced with the conflict between development and conservation, many nations find it unrealistic and economically not feasible to conserve all other biological wealth. In fact, the number of species waiting to be saved from extinction far exceeds the conservation resources available. On a global basis, this problem has been addressed by eminent conservationists. They identified for maximum protection certain biodiversity hotspots regions with very high levels of species richness and high degree of endemism. On a global basis, this problem has been addressed by eminent conservationists. They identify the maximum protection certain biodiversity hotspots regions with very high levels of species richness and high degree of endemism. That is, species confined to that region are not found anywhere else. Initially, 25 biodiversity hotspots were identified. Subsequently, 9 more have been added to the list, bringing to the total number of highlands in the world to 34. These hotspots are also regions of accelerated habitat loss. Important. These hotspots are also regions of accelerated habitat loss. 3 of these hotspots, Western Ghats and Sri Lanka, into Burma and Himalaya, cover our country's exceptionally high diversity regions. Although all the biodiversity hotspots put together cover less than 2% of the Earth's land area, the number of species they collectively have is extremely high, and strict protection of this object could reduce the ongoing massacre by almost 30%. 2% of the Earth's land. Reduce the 30%. In India, ecologically unique and biodiversity rich regions are legally protected as biosphere reserves, national parks, and sanctuaries. India now has 14 biosphere reserves, 90 national parks, and 448 wildlife sanctuaries. India has also a history of religious and cultural traditions that emphasize protection of nature. In many cultural tracts of forest were set aside and all the trees and wildlife within were venerated and given total protection. Such sanctuaries are found in Khasi and Jaintia hills in Meghalaya, Western Ghat regions of Karnataka and Maharashtra, and the Sarguja, Chanda and Bastar areas of Madhya Pradesh. In Meghalaya, the sacred woods are the last refuges for large number of rare and threatened plants. Ex-situ conservation. In this approach, threatened animals and plants are taken out from their natural habitat and placed in special setting where they can be protected and given special care. Zoological parks, botanical gardens, and wildlife safari parks serve this purpose. There are many animals that have become extinct in the wild but continue to maintain in zoological parks. In recent years, exotic conservation has advanced beyond keeping threatened species in enclosures. Now, gametes of threatened species can be preserved in viable and fertile condition for long periods using cryopreservation techniques. Eggs can be fertilized in vitro and plants can be propagated using tissue culture methods. Seeds of different genetic strains of commercially important plants can be kept for long periods in seed banks. Biodiversity knows no political boundaries and its conservation is therefore a collective responsibility of all nations. The Historic Convention on Biological Diversity, the Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 called upon all nations to take appropriate measures for conservation of biodiversity and sustainable utilization of its money. Why Earth Summit was called Conservation of Biodiversity and Sustainable Utilization of its money. In follow-up, the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in 2002 in Johannesburg, South Africa. After 10 years, 190 countries commitment to achieve by 2010 a significant reduction in the current rate of biodiversity loss, global, regional, and local levels. That was for today's. And what could we say? Greater 70% of them, the group fungi has more species or vertebrate species combined. See, this is controversial line. The group fungi has more species than all the vertebrate species combined. No, all not. That's PARM. Aves are not combined. India with about 45,000 species. Many species is one of the 12 models. The next one comes here. In biosphere reserves are important. 90 national parks, 49 sanctuaries, 34 biodiversity hotspots, in vitro fertilization, tissue propagation, and cultivation of gametes. Fine, that was too much for today.